My name is Henrik Enderlein. I'm a professor of political economy at the Hertie School of Governance, a public policy school here in Berlin. And the topic of this session is the impact of inequality on macroeconomic dynamics. And I'm very pleased this topic is on the agenda. I wanted to introduce this as an anecdote. The good thing about being the moderator of the panel is that you don't have to present work on substance, but that you can tell an anecdote to keep everyone awake. When I was a graduate student, a PhD student in my first year at Columbia, I accompanied a friend of mine into the introductory lecture on macroeconomics of SIPA, the public policy school at Columbia. And the professor presented his syllabus, and at the end, a young lady raised her hand and said, "Aren't we talking about inequality?" And the professor answered his usual, it's a very good question, but you know, this is an economics class. If you're interested in inequality, you should go and attend a political science class. And I thought this was a very revealing anecdote. And I remembered this anecdote a few years ago when I was teaching myself an intro class to economics at the Hertie School of Governance. And at the end of my presentation of the syllabus, a student was asking the question, "Aren't we talking about inequality?" And I probably answered something like, this is an economics class, and figured that I myself, in my teaching, do very little on inequality. Who in this room is teaching intro classes to economics? Who of you has a full session on inequality in that syllabus? I was expecting James Galbraith to say yes, but as we can see in this room, the majority of you don't cover inequality, and this is why this panel is here. So I'm pleased to have you, and I'm now coming to my second task, which is introducing the speakers to you. We will give them 15 minutes, more or less, to each of them. All of the papers or presentations are available online, so if you want to go back, you can find them there. And let me briefly introduce the four. You find their Vita CVs in the booklets and online, so I'm only going to tell you the two quick facts you need to know, and then something which you might want to remember about all of them, because they all have striking features in their bios. Peter Bofinger, he's a member of the German government's Council of Economic Advisors and a professor at the University of Würzburg. And what I find striking about Peter is that, and I only realized this here, Peter worked in the two institutions, or I should say, for those of you who don't know him, all of you know him, but he's a bit of a dissenting voice in German economic discussions, especially in the Council of Economic Advisors. But Peter worked in the two institutions that are as mainstream as it gets in German economic thinking. One is the Council of Economic Advisors, not as a member, but as an economist, and the other one is the Bundesbank. And so then he made his way into academia and is now this very important dissenting voice we have. James Galbraith doesn't need an introduction. Two very quick things. The one thing I found striking was, I think James Galbraith is the only one with a job title that has all of the keywords that we cover here in his job title. I read the job title to you. He's Lloyd M. Benson Chair in Government and Business Relations and Professor of Economics at the LBJ School of Public Affairs at the University of Texas. So we have government, business, economics, and public affairs in one job title. This is exactly what we need. What you didn't want to know about James Galbraith is that between 1993 and 97, he served as Chief Technical Advisor to China's State Planning Commission. So this is an experience which is probably very peculiar. Arjun Jayadev is an assistant professor at the University of Massachusetts in Boston, working on distributional outcomes. What I found striking about Arjun, in an interview, he describes that he grew up in Bangalore, a city not known at that time, only known later on, as he said in this interview, because of simple-minded comments by New York Times columnist Tom Friedman. I thought the simple-minded comments about Bangalore by Tom Friedman were striking. So you experienced inequality in your own vita. Michael Komhoff is Deputy Division Chief of the Modeling Division at the IMF. And the thing which is striking about his vita is that he says himself his main responsibility is the development of the IMF's global macroeconomic model, GIMF. We all know this model, but the fact that we know is in itself puzzling. If I describe to someone that there is a model on a global integrated monetary and fiscal model, this is the moment people start talking to you. and say, how can economists think they can model something? And as your Vita describes, and I quote, recent work on improving the theoretical and empirical foundations of this model added an oil sector to analyze the issues of resource depletion and a banking sector to study capital adequacy regulation and monetary reform proposals. So this is recent. We've now added oil and banking to the global model. I think there's still some parts which are not covered in that model. But besides working on this model, Michael works on inequality, and he'll present a paper co-authored with Romain Rancière. And I now look forward to your presentations. We'll go in the order of Peter Bofinger, James Galbraith, Arjun, and then Michael, 15 minutes each. I'll allow very short questions on content after each presentation, and then we open up for a broader discussion. Okay, the floor is yours, Peter.
Yeah, let me welcome you. And as when Hendrik was asking who has been teaching macroeconomics, I said yes. And then he asked who has been teaching distribution issues in his macroeconomics classes. I didn't say yes, because so far I haven't done this. It was only due to the organizers who asked me to say something on this topic at this conference that I thought, well, let's start it. Let's try to bring things together that one might teach in a macroeconomics class on distribution. So that's my first attempt in this field, but there are obviously more qualified experts on the issues. So if I do not cover everything, you will get the rest in the 4 other papers. Well, when I was thinking about this impact of inequality, the question is it something new that we talk about inequality? Is it something new that we think that inequality has an impact on macroeconomic growth and on macroeconomic dynamics? But as always, one ends up with Keynes, so of course already was aware of the fact that income distribution matters for saving, for consumption, and therefore also for macroeconomic dynamics. And the question is now, what are the channels by which inequality can affect macroeconomic outcomes? And I think the channel goes first via savings. So the question is, what impact does inequality have on savings? And then the second channel is, what effect has savings on growth? And of course, you all will see this is really broad and complex issues. And so I will try to make a simple narrative out of it, but that's what we can then discuss. But these are the channels I think that one has to discuss. What is the effect on savings, and what is the effect on growth? As far as the effect on savings is concerned, there are 2 different effects. One effect is that if you distribute income from people with low incomes to people with high incomes, you would expect that this by itself raises the savings rate, because the high-income people normally have much higher savings rate than the low-income people. I've quoted in my paper some data for Germany, for the US. So if you did have this distribution effect, you would expect that growing inequality tends to increase the savings rates. On the other hand, there's another hypothesis saying, well, if the low-income people want to maintain their standard of living, kind of relative income hypothesis, they can reduce their savings rate so much that this overcompensates the distributional effect from low income to high income people. So these are 2 different hypotheses, and so 2 different outcomes might be possible. Well, if one looks at first sight at the savings rate in the OECD area and the Gini coefficient, one might come to the result, well, of course, income inequality has increased considerably since 1985. Until 2005, and in the same period, the OECD savings rate has declined. So can you see? Yeah. So one could say, well, obviously, growing inequality has led to a decline in the savings rate. But nevertheless, if you take this aggregate picture, you can also look at the more disaggregated picture. And what I also do in the following is I do not cover the whole 20, 30 years, but only the period 95 to 2005, because I think this is an interesting period. We had all the excesses in financial markets, and as you can see from the chart, that from 95 to 2005, inequality has increased really very much, so I think that's a good period to analyze. So from the aggregate picture, I would say, well, more inequality, savings rates goes down. So if one then looks at the development of the savings rate of the income distribution in the last in this period 95 to 2005, one can say, well, it's a not so homogeneous picture. There are countries where inequality has increased considerably. Astonishingly, countries with a more social state, welfare state model are the countries where inequality has increased very much. Germany and the Scandinavian countries, Austria. So Germany is one of the countries where Gini coefficient has risen most. And inequality has declined in countries like Spain, Belgium, Greece, UK, Ireland, Hungary, and Italy. So it's not a homogeneous picture. And so what I've now tried is just ask myself, can we see any relationship between these changes in the Gini coefficient and the changes in the savings rate of these countries? And what one can see is not a very strong correlation, but there seems to be a positive correlation. So in countries where inequality has increased, savings rate has gone up. Countries where inequality has declined, savings rate went down. You know, there were countries like Ireland, like Spain, where inequality has declined, and these countries also, the spending was relatively high. And so one would not come to the result that the inequality has led to a reduction of the savings rate. And that's also what you can see in the literature on the United States. There's lots of studies try to find out what is the impact of inequality on the savings rate. And there are many studies who say, well, there's no impact. There are some studies who say it's a positive correlation, but there's almost no study who says there is a negative relationship, so that more inequality leads to a decline in the savings rate. So that's what is also confirmed by this simple scatter plot. What I also then try to look is to do is take countries where inequality has increased very much, and that's Germany for the OECD countries and China as a non-OECD country, and then ask what's happened there. And in Germany, you can see that, again, that the Gini coefficient has increased. And on the left panel, you can see the aggregate savings rate. It has declined until 2000, but then in the period where the Gini coefficient has increased very much, the aggregate savings rate went up. And you can see the lower 50% of income earners, they in fact have reduced their savings rate, but it has been overcompensated by the increase of the savings, by the distributional effect to the upper 50%. And what I think is interesting, and that's something what I probably has to analyze more, is that maybe these Gini coefficients do not get the full story, because there a lot of income is generated in the enterprise sector, which is not counted as household savings. And so I have here for Germany at the right panel the wage share in Germany, which is impressive. I think so. The wage share in Germany from 2000 to 2007 has declined from 72 to 64%, which is, there's no other country, as far as I know, where the wage share has gone down so dramatically. It has improved a little bit again by this, so that's something I say this is why German economy is doing quite well, that this kind of redistribution has taken place, domestic demand has increased. The funny thing in Germany, nobody has realized that. So that's really the funny thing. So many of my German colleagues say wage moderation is really the recipe for our success, but since 2007 there is no more wage moderation. It's not the full compensation of what's happened before, but at least some change has taken place. But obviously German companies are still in such a good shape that they don't even feel they don't even complain about that. Anyhow, so the interesting thing is that the savings rate now defined as the savings of the total economy has gone up drastically, much more. So you can see this overall household savings rate, it has not changed drastically in this period. But if you take the savings rate, which includes the savings of the corporate sector, you can see the dramatic increase of the savings rate in this period. And of course, it also has gone down a little bit after you had this redistribution. And the German experience is similar to the German experience, the Chinese experience. We can also see that while the Gini coefficient has increased, and in China it has really increased dramatically. So it's much more increase than we had in other countries. So it has gone up from, let's say, something 0.32 to 45. And in Germany, it has gone up from 0.25 to 29. So China has really a drastic, very drastic increase in inequality. And what you can see is that also the household savings rate has increased very much. So one could say, well, if one looks at what has happened in the countries, one would come to the conclusion that higher inequality tends to increase the savings rate. The question is then, how does this affect growth? What's the nexus from savings to growth? And there we have two different theories. We have the Neoclassical Theory, which is embedded in most models, which say, well, savings are good for growth because savings means more investment. I think that's the whole growth theory says this is the same. More savings means more investment. But we know from Keynesian economics that, of course, a decision to save is not the same thing as a decision to invest. These are two completely different decisions, and a decision to save can mean that you increase your financial assets, but that does not, which depresses growth, and which does not have any positive effect on growth. So these are these two different approaches. I must say I have a lot of sympathy for the Keynesian approach, and the question now, how have the savings been used that were generated by growing inequality? Well, I think this is something you can see from the current account. So if a country decides to save and everything is invested, current account remains zero. If it decides to save but it does not invest very much, then you get a current account surplus. So I think that's a simple relationship. And again, I've looked at my small database, and I have taken the average current account balance of OECD countries in the period 95 to 2000, and then 2001 to 2006, and then I have taken the Gini coefficient, and you get, again, a positive correlation between higher inequality and a change in the current account balance. I did then the same again for my two countries, China and Germany, and you can see for both countries that the current account improved in this period where the inequality increased. Michael says in his paper that in China it's due to the fact that financial markets are not so developed, but there are also Chinese authors who say this is not true, but I'm not an expert on these issues. But at least for Germany, I would maintain that our financial markets are not repressed, and that there's no problems for German households to get money. So I would say, well, we see this correlation that growing inequality leads to a tendency to current account surpluses. The question is, how has this affected on growth? And of course, now this is a very difficult issue, and it's only a very broad thing that I want to show, that in the period 2000 to 2005, the growth in the advanced economies growth rate was lower than before, but I would say this is definitively not a proof that the inequality has had a negative impact. It's different in the emerging and developing economies, where the period 2000 to 2005 and after had been a period associated with very high growth. Well, in the case of China, one could say, well, the high savings of China were only partly used for financial assets, but a very large part was used for capital formation, which you can see here. So that one can say, well, most of the savings were used, had a positive effect on growth, and only a minor part, which led to the current account surplus, had a negative impact. By the way, this is, I think, one of really impressive developments in China, that in a country which had such a huge expansion over decades, that the share of consumption in GDP went down from 50% to 33%. That's I think, when I made this chart for the first time, I was really amazed. It's really fascinating to see how this growth process has worked so far. That only 30, so the figure for Germany is 55, for the US it's about 70, for Greece it's about 72. It's also 70 in Greece, so China is really an interesting case. So my argument would be, well, growing inequality has led to a tendency to build up financial savings, which by itself had a negative impact on growth. But as we know that the overall savings rate has gone down, there must have been other reasons why the savings rate has gone down, and I would say maybe it was due to this real estate boom that has taken place, that had a countervailing effect on this, that compensated it at least until the period, until the time we had the financial crisis. And I can show you this with this chart. In the blue bars show the situation 2000 to 2007, and it shows private sector financial balances. Yeah? So it's the difference, current account minus the balance of the public sector, and so you get the financial balance of the private sector, and you can see that in fact from until the crisis the world was split in two parts. There were countries where the private sector had a huge financial deficit, and the other half they had the surpluses. And these were the countries like China, like Germany, like the Scandinavian countries, where also inequality has increased very much. So this has been compensated by excessive credits and all you know. But the interesting thing, after the financial crisis has broken out, we have now an overall tendency of the private sector to have positive balances. You can call it deleveraging, of course, but in my view, it also shows that now this countervailing effect on the positive impact of inequality on financial balances is no longer there. So we have only the depressing effect of this positive financial savings. And how has it been solved so far? Well, we have the public sector who has been willing to have all the deficits that you need for the surplus of the private sector. And so a non-sustainable model has been sustained, at least for some years. And of course, the main risk now is if the public sector is no longer able to fill this gap, we get all kinds of problems. And so let me end up with economic thinking, old and new. Here in Germany, we had a very famous Minister of Economics, Ludwig Erhard, and he phrased the formula Wohlstand für alle, well-being for all. And I think it is a philosophy that is as simple as also as important, that if you have an economy that is growing, if you have increasing productivity, if there are more goods available, there must be people who are able to buy it. And if the incomes are not widely shared, this is not a sustainable story. And of course you can do it with debt. Private debt, public debt, you can make it sustainable, but in the long run it doesn't work. And the nice thing is that what Ludwig Erhard in his this 50s style was writing has now been confirmed by an IMF study by Andrew Berg and Jonathan Ostry, who more or less say the same thing. So I think that's the message. And maybe let me end with one short remark also on, I didn't say where inequality comes from, but when Adair Turner was talking about yesterday, he said he gave the impression that inequality is more or less the result of economic pressures, tendencies, but I think it has also to do a lot with institutions. And I think that's important. And if you ask how get we out of this process towards more inequality, we need institutions that protect the workers. But what we do right now in all these so-called problem countries is that we have structural reforms which reduce the bargaining powers of workers. So by the institutions, we increase these tendencies towards inequality. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Peter. As mentioned, if there are direct questions, not understanding something from the presentation, I would allow them now. But just one, please. Go ahead. Are there other ones that we collect them? Please.
Thank you. Hello, Michael Jakob from the Potsdam Institute for Climate Impact Research. You've made a very convincing case that for Germany and China, higher inequality is connected to higher savings rates. Yeah. But this seems to run counter to the experience we had in the US, where actually in the last decades we've seen persistence rises inequality, but declining savings rates and an increasing current account deficit. So.
Well, but if you look at the whole literature in the US on the reasons for the decline in savings rates, normally they don't talk about inequality. They have all kinds of reasons, they talk of all kinds of puzzles, they talk about demographics and everything, but I must say, I don't work in this field very long, but I have found no study, US study, which says we can show that the decline in the US savings rate is related to inequality. I didn't find that. I think the consensus more or less is it's a puzzle. So that's what, at least I'm not an expert on what you can find in the US, but that's what the literature says. But it needs, at first sight you're right, it's such a convincing story. When I started it, I thought this is really, that's it. But then if you look at all the papers that are written, you say, no, that's okay.
Good.